In early 1945, Europe groaned under the relentless advance of Allied armies. German forces retreated eastward to the Oder River and westward to the Rhine. Adolf Hitler barricaded in Berlin's bunkers, issued orders for unyielding resistance, ignoring the collapsing fronts. Allied air forces operating from bases in Britain and newly liberated France dominated the skies, their bombers delivering payloads with a range of 1,600 miles at 26,000 feet. The contrast was undeniable. German territory shrank daily, while Allied supply lines stretched unbroken across oceans and continents. The war's momentum had shifted decisively, moving from operational contests to the systematic dismantling of Nazi Germany's war machine. German armies, once the scourge of Europe, faced insurmountable odds. In the East, Soviet divisions equipped with T-34 tanks advanced with mechanical precision, reclaiming vast swathes of territory lost since 1941. In the West, American, British, and Commonwealth troops pressed through Belgium, their Sherman tanks rolling over fields scarred by years of conflict. Fuel shortages crippled German panzer divisions, limiting their operational range to under 100 miles without resupply. Allied air superiority grounded the Luftwaffe, with German airfields managing only 10 sorties per day under relentless bombardment. The number that matters is fuel. German tanks stalled after 50 hours at full throttle. From Berlin, Hitler's directives grew increasingly detached, demanding counterattacks from divisions reduced to shadows of their former strength. German commanders, staring at maps pockmarked with red arrows, reported dwindling reserves. Some units operated at 30% capacity. Allied logistics, by contrast, ensured a steady flow of men, munitions, and machines. The United States alone produced 40,000 aircraft in 1944, dwarfing Germany's output of 9,000. The Reich's industrial heartland factories in the Ruhr and Silesia lay vulnerable, their smokestacks silenced by precision bombing and imminent capture. German civilians huddled in shelters endured nightly air raids, their cities reduced to smouldering ruins under incendiary storms. The skies told a story of domination. Allied bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, flew unopposed over German territory, targeting rail yards and oil refineries. Each mission disrupted the Reich's ability to move troops or fuel, with synthetic fuel plants operating at 20% capacity. German anti-aircraft guns, manned by conscripts, fired blindly into clouds, their shells falling short of bombers cruising at 30,000 feet. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of terror, was a ghost, its pilots grounded, its hangars empty. Allied airfields, by contrast, buzzed with activity, launching 1,000 sorties daily, each plane returning to rearm within hours. On the ground, the situation was no less grim. German soldiers retreating across frozen fields abandoned tanks and artillery, their supply trucks immobilized by empty tanks. Soviet artillery, firing 10,000 shells per hour, pounded defensive lines, while American and British forces advanced behind creeping barrages. The Rhine, once a formidable barrier, loomed as the next Allied objective, its bridges targeted by desperate German sappers. In the east, the Oder River marked the final defensive line before Berlin, but Soviet engineers bridged it with alarming speed. German civilians fleeing westward clogged roads, their possessions piled on carts as Allied aircraft strafed from above. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of ground baffled his generals. Orders arrived daily demanding divisions that no longer existed to launch offensives that could not succeed. The Reich's communication networks, reliant on telegraph lines, faltered under bombing and sabotage, leaving field commanders isolated. Allied intelligence, bolstered by decrypted German messages, anticipated every move, ensuring no German counterattack caught them unprepared. The United States industrial output, producing 10 million tons of merchant cargo annually, sustained this relentless advance, while Germany's U-boats sank only 1 million tons, a futile effort against an oceanic lifeline. The human toll was visible everywhere. German prisoners, captured in the thousands, shuffled in ragged columns, their faces gaunt from hunger and defeat. Allied soldiers, by contrast, moved with confidence, their rations and fuel arriving like clockwork. In liberated towns, civilians emerged from cellars, waving flags of gratitude as American jeeps rolled through. The Reich's propaganda, still blaring from radios, spoke of wonder weapons and final victories, but the reality was stark. Germany's war machine was breaking apart piece by piece. Adversaries' view. German generals hunched over tattered maps, cursed Allied bombers flattening their supply depots. The Reich's fate was sealed, yet defiance persisted. The collapse was not a single moment but a process each day tightening the noose. Allied air forces, with their 1,600-mile range, ensured no factory or rail line operated unmolested. German commanders, once masters of blitzkrieg, now scrambled to hold fragments of territory, their orders ignored by exhausted troops. The Rhine and Oder natural barriers offered brief hope, but Allied engineering bridging rivers in days rendered them irrelevant. The war fought on Germany's borders was no longer about victory, but survival. Germany's early conquests, from 1939 to 1942, relied on rapid, decisive campaigns against isolated adversaries. Poland fell in weeks, France in months. Blitzkrieg tactics, combining panzer mobility with Luftwaffe precision, overwhelmed uncoordinated defences across Europe. By 1941, German forces occupied territory from Norway's fjords to Greece's islands, their supply lines stretching 1,000 miles from Berlin. The Wehrmacht's tanks, moving at 20 miles per hour, struck with surgical speed supported by dive bombers flying 200 sorties daily. Yet, beneath this dominance lay vulnerabilities exposed by strategic overreach that would doom the Third Reich. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, marked the first fatal miscalculation. Operation Barbarossa aimed to crush Soviet forces in a single campaign, but the Eastern Front spanned 2,000 miles of forest, steppe and swamp. German divisions, expecting victory by autumn, faced endless Soviet reserves and brutal winters, their tanks bogged down in mud and snow. Fuel consumption critical for mobility drained reserves, with panzers requiring 50 gallons per 100 miles. The Luftwaffe, stretched across multiple fronts, could not maintain air superiority, its sorties dropping to 100 daily by 1942. Compounding this error, Germany declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, inviting an industrial giant into the conflict. America's factories, untouched by bombing, produced 10 million tons of merchant cargo, annually ferrying supplies across the Atlantic to Britain and the Soviet Union. Germany's U-boats, sinking only 1 million tons yearly, failed to disrupt this lifeline, their submarines hunted by Allied destroyers equipped with radar. The United States built 40,000 aircraft in 1943 alone, while Germany struggled to produce 9,000. The number that matters is production. Allied factories churned out 10,000 tanks yearly by 1943. Allied leaders, meeting at conferences in 1942 and 1943, forged a unified strategy demanding Germany's unconditional surrender. The Casablanca Conference in January 1943 prioritized the European theater, coordinating British, American, and Soviet efforts. Strategic bombing campaigns launched from British airfields targeted German industry, reducing synthetic fuel output by 30%. B-17, flying fortresses, flying at 26,000 feet, delivered payloads with a range of 1,600 miles, crippling factories in the Ruhr. German defences, reliant on flak guns, expended 10,000 shells per downed bomber, an unsustainable drain. German commanders, once emboldened by victories, saw their strategic position erode. The Eastern Front demanded endless divisions, with 1 million German troops committed by 1942, yet Soviet counter-offensives gained ground. In the West, Britain's survival ensured a staging ground for future invasions, its ports receiving American convoys weekly. Germany's declaration of war on America had unified a transatlantic coalition whose combined industrial output dwarfed the Reich's. The Kriegsmarine, tasked with blockading Britain, lost 50 U-boats monthly to Allied escorts, their crews unable to match America's shipbuilding pace. The Luftwaffe, a cornerstone of early successes, faltered under competing demands. Pilots trained for short campaigns faced attrition, with losses of 100 aircraft monthly by 1943. Fuel shortages, grounded squadrons, limiting flights to 10 hours per aircraft. Allied air forces, by contrast, scaled up operations, flying 1,000 sorties daily by 1944, their Mustangs and Spitfires outranging German Messerschmitts. The Reich's early advantage, surprise, and concentration dissolved against opponents who adapted, outproduced, and coordinated across continents. German logistics, stretched thin, could not sustain multiple fronts. Rail networks vital for moving coal and steel operated at 60% capacity, disrupted by partisan sabotage and bombing. Factories in occupied territories reliant on forced labor produced unevenly, their output halved by material shortages. Soviet armies, re-equipped with American trucks, maintained supply lines 1,000 miles long, their mobility outpacing German horse-drawn carts. The Wehrmacht, designed for rapid victories, was ill-suited for prolonged attrition, its divisions bleeding men and machines. Hitler's strategic vision, rooted in ideological fervor, ignored these realities. Orders demanded relentless offensives, even as divisions reported 30% strength. The Soviet Union, far from collapsing, mobilized millions, its factories relocated beyond the Urals, safe from Luftwaffe raids. American industry, producing 100,000 vehicles yearly, ensured Allied armies moved faster and farther. Germany's gamble, conquering Europe before facing a global coalition, had failed, its resources spread across a fracturing empire. The turning point came not in a single battle, but in the grinding accumulation of Allied advantages. British intelligence, decoding German Enigma messages, anticipated Wehrmacht movements, neutralizing counterattacks. Soviet T-34 tanks, outnumbering Panzers 3-1, rolled westward, their crews hardened by years of war. American merchant ships, escorted by destroyers, delivered 5,000 tons of supplies daily to Allied ports. Germany's early triumphs, built on speed and shock, could not withstand this coalition, whose industrial and strategic unity turned the tide. Adversaries' view, German planners poring over shipping logs, despaired as Atlantic convoys outran their sinking U-boats. The Reich's war machine, once a juggernaut, now staggered under its own weight. Fuel shortages limiting panzer range to 100 miles crippled mobility. Allied air forces, with their 1,600-mile reach, struck at will, their bombs leveling factories and rail yards. German commanders reporting to Berlin warned of unsustainable losses, their divisions unable to hold ground against converging enemies. The war, begun with visions of rapid conquest, had become a contest of endurance Germany could not win. Allied strategic bombing, launched from airfields in Britain and the United States bases in liberated territories, struck relentlessly at Germany's industrial core through 1943 and 1944. Factories in the Ruhr, producing steel and synthetic fuel, faced nightly raids by B-17 flying fortresses and Lancaster bombers, their payloads dropping from 26,000 feet with a range of 1,600 miles. Output in these plants, critical for panzer production, fell by 40% as fires consumed assembly lines and workers fled. The Luftwaffe, tasked with defending the skies, lost 100 aircraft monthly to Allied fighters, its pilots unable to match the P-51 Mustang's speed or endurance. German anti-aircraft batteries, firing 10,000 shells per raid, rarely hit their targets, depleting ammunition reserves without stemming the tide. In the Mediterranean, Allied campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, beginning in 1942, forced Germany to commit divisions to new fronts. The invasion of Italy in September 1943, with American and British troops landing at Salerno, stretched German resources further, requiring 20 divisions to garrison mountainous terrain. These units, drawn from the Eastern Front, weakened Germany's ability to counter Soviet advances. Italian railways, vital for supplying German troops, operated at 50% capacity, disrupted by partisan attacks and Allied airstrikes. The number that matters is rail capacity. German logistics lost 50% to bombing by 1944. Soviet forces, recovering from early defeats, turned the tide at Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Their T-34 tanks, outnumbering German panzers 3-1, shattered the Wehrmacht's offensive capability, destroying 600 tanks in days. By 1944, Soviet armies, supported by American-supplied trucks, pushed westward, liberating Ukraine and Belarus, with mechanized columns advancing 20 miles daily. German defenses, reliant on static fortifications, crumbled under artillery barrages, firing 10,000 shells per hour. Fuel shortages grounded Luftwaffe squadrons after 20 hours of flight time, leaving Soviet troops unopposed from the air. The Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, opened a second front, with 1 million Allied troops ashore by August, supported by 10,000 aircraft. American, British and Canadian forces breaking out from beachheads liberated Paris by August 25, their Sherman tanks rolling 100 miles in weeks. German counterattacks, hampered by fuel shortages limiting panzer range to 50 miles, failed to halt the advance. Allied air forces flying 2,000 sorties daily strafed retreating German columns, destroying 1,000 vehicles in the Falaise pocket alone. The Rhine River, Germany's western barrier, loomed as the next objective, its bridges targeted by desperate German engineers. The cumulative effect of these campaigns eroded Germany's war machine to its breaking point. Occupied territories, once sources of oil, grain and labor, fell to Allied advances, with Romania's oil fields captured by Soviet forces in August 1944. German divisions reduced to 10,000 men, each lacked the mobility to maneuver their horses and trucks, immobilized by fuel scarcity. The Reich's industrial output, dependent on coal and steel, plummeted as bombing raids severed supply chains. Synthetic fuel plants, producing 1 million barrels monthly in 1943, dropped to 200,000 by 1944. German commanders reporting to Berlin detailed the unraveling situation: factories, silent railways destroyed, and troops exhausted. The Wehrmacht, designed for rapid offensives, could not adapt to defensive warfare against a coalition with superior resources. Allied logistics, moving 10 million tons of cargo annually across the Atlantic, ensured a steady flow of munitions and men. Soviet armies, equipped with 5,000 American trucks, maintained supply lines stretching 1,000 miles, their mobility outpacing German foot soldiers. British intelligence, decoding Enigma messages, anticipated German movements, neutralizing counterattacks before they began. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German might, was a shadow of its former self. Training programs rushed to replace lost pilots, produced recruits with 10 hours of flight time, insufficient against Allied veterans. German airfields, cratered by bombs, managed only 10 sorties daily, their runways littered with wrecked Messerschmitts. Allied air forces, by contrast, operated with mechanical efficiency, their bases launching 1,600-mile missions daily. The skies over Germany, once contested, belonged to the Allies, their bombers unmolested by a grounded enemy. German civilians, enduring relentless air raids, saw their cities transform into rubble. Hamburg, Cologne and Dresden burned under firestorms, with 60% of urban infrastructure destroyed. Civilians fleeing to shelters faced shortages of food and heat, their morale eroded by propaganda, promising victories that never came. The Reich's economy, reliant on forced labor, faltered as workers deserted or were killed in raids. Rail networks, moving 50% fewer trains, could not deliver coal-starving factories and homes alike. Adversaries' view, German logisticians, staring at empty fuel depots, despaired as Allied tanks crossed rivers their panzers could not reach. The erosion was relentless, each campaign tightening the noose around Germany. Strategic bombing reduced industrial output, Mediterranean fronts drained reserves, Soviet advances broke the Eastern Front, and Normandy opened the West. Allied coordination, American production, British intelligence, Soviet manpower ensured no respite. German divisions, once feared, were hollow shells, their tanks stranded and aircraft grounded. The Reich's collapse, though not yet complete, was inevitable, its strategic missteps now compounded by operational defeat. Section 4. War on the Ground. Frontline Perspectives. Previous section text continues seamlessly from where this left off. By late 1944, Western Allied soldiers advancing through France and the Low Countries observed a German army in disarray, its once formidable units surrendering in droves. American, British and Canadian troops moving behind 2,000 Sherman tanks, noted German prisoners, gaunt and demoralized, marching in ragged columns under guard. German air activity, a constant threat in earlier years, had dwindled to near silence, with Luftwaffe sorties limited to 10 aircraft at a time, grounded by fuel shortages restricting range to 50 miles. Civilians in liberated towns emerging from cellars spoke of German deserters hiding in forests, their equipment abandoned in muddy fields. Allied convoys stretching 1,000 miles from Normandy, ports delivered supplies with clockwork precision, their trucks rolling unhindered by enemy aircraft. Soviet troops pushing through Poland and East Prussia in 1944 wielded overwhelming firepower, their artillery batteries firing 10,000 shells daily. Unlike 1941, when German panzers overran their lines, Soviet forces now advanced with mechanized columns supported by 5,000 American-supplied trucks. T-34 tanks outnumbering German armor rolled over defensive trenches, their crews hardened by years of war. Supply lines extending 1,000 miles from Moscow remained intact, delivering fuel and munitions to sustain offensives. The number that matters is shells. Soviet barrages lasted 2 hours before advances. German fortifications, manned by conscripts and depleted units, collapsed under the weight of coordinated assaults, their bunkers reduced to rubble. German civilians, enduring relentless air raids, faced a collapsing world in cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. Firestorms triggered by Allied incendiary bombs destroyed 60% of urban infrastructure, leaving streets choked with debris and ash. Families huddled in shelters, their rations cut to 1,000 calories daily as public services, water, electricity, heat failed under the strain of bombing. Propaganda posters promising victory peeled from ruined walls, ignored by a population weary of false hope. Children conscripted into anti-aircraft crews, manned guns with minimal training, firing blindly at bombers, cruising at 26,000 feet, their shells falling short of targets. German officers reporting to Berlin's bunkers detailed a litany of shortages, fuel, aircraft, ammunition, and trained personnel. Panzer divisions reduced to 10 operational tanks per unit could not execute counterattacks, their mobility limited to 50 miles without resupply. Luftwaffe pilots with only 10 hours of training faced Allied aces in P-51 Mustangs, their Messerschmitts outmatched in speed and range. Orders from Hitler demanding relentless defense went unfulfilled as field commanders grappled with units at 30% strength. Communication lines reliant on telegraph and radio faltered under sabotage and bombing, leaving garrisons isolated and unable to coordinate. Allied soldiers, by contrast, moved with confidence, their morale bolstered by steady supplies and air cover. American GIs, chewing gum and sharing cigarettes, drove jeeps through French villages, greeted by waving civilians. British troops brewing tea beside their tanks observed German prisoners, some as young as 16, surrendering without a fight. Canadian units, advancing through Dutch polders, marveled at the absence of Luftwaffe planes, their skies dominated by Allied Spitfires, flying 1,600-mile missions. The contrast was stark. Allied armies well-fed and equipped pressed forward, while German forces starving and immobile retreated or surrendered. Soviet advances, relentless and brutal, transformed the Eastern Front. Red Army soldiers, clad in winter coats, marched through Polish snow, their boots crunching over abandoned German rifles. Artillery crews working in shifts maintained barrages that turned fields into craters, their guns supplied by rail convoys stretching 1,000 miles. German defenders outnumbered and outgunned abandoned pillboxes, their morale broken by the sight of endless Soviet tanks. Civilians in East Prussia fleeing westward clogged roads with carts and bundles, their villages burning under Soviet shelling. German officers, once proud architects of blitzkrieg, now faced impossible odds. Reports to Berlin described fuel depots, empty aircraft grounded, and recruits untrained for modern warfare. Panzer crews rationing gasoline abandoned tanks after 50 miles, their vehicles left as smouldering wrecks under Allied airstrikes. The Luftwaffe, reduced to 200 operational aircraft, could not contest the skies, its runways cratered by bombs. Allied air forces, flying 2,000 sorties daily, targeted bridges and rail yards, ensuring German troops could not regroup or retreat. Adversaries' view, German sergeants shivering in trenches whispered of empty depots and skies ruled by enemy fighters. The war's reality seen from the ground was one of collapse. German soldiers, once conquerors, now scavenged for food, their uniforms tattered and boots worn through. Allied troops, by contrast, advanced with mechanical efficiency, their tanks fueled and rifles loaded. Civilians caught in the crossfire bore the brunt of the Reich's failure, their cities reduced to rubble and their futures uncertain. The fronts east and west told a singular story. Germany's war machine, bled dry by years of attrition, could no longer resist the Allied tide. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive in the Ardennes, deploying 200,000 troops to break through Allied lines in Belgium. The attack, shrouded in fog that grounded Allied aircraft, achieved fleeting surprise, with panzer divisions advancing 30 miles into snow-covered forests. American defenders, caught off guard, held key crossroads, delaying German spearheads as fuel shortages stalled tanks after 50 miles of movement. By January 1945, skies cleared, and Allied air forces, flying 2,000 sorties daily, unleashed devastation on German columns, destroying 1,000 vehicles in days. The offensive, intended to split Allied armies and force negotiations, collapsed, costing Germany irreplaceable reserves of men and armor. On the Eastern Front, Soviet winter offensives beginning January 12, 1945, shattered German defenses along the Vistula River. T-34 tanks, supported by 5,000 artillery guns, rolled forward, firing 10,000 shells per hour to pulverize fortifications. Soviet armies, advancing 20 miles daily, reached the Oder River by February, isolating East Prussia's garrisons. German troops, reduced to 10,000 per division, lacked fuel to maneuver their panzers, stranded after 50 miles. The Luftwaffe, grounded by shortages, managed only 10 sorties daily, leaving Soviet columns unopposed from the air. The number that matters is crossings 3. Rhine bridges secured by April 1945. Western allies, undeterred by the Ardennes setback, crossed the Rhine in March 1945, exploiting a stroke of fortune at Remagen. American troops seized an intact bridge on March 7, enabling 50,000 soldiers to pour across daily, supported by 1,600-mile bombing missions. British and Canadian forces, crossing further north, established bridgeheads, their engineers assembling pontoon spans under fire. German attempts to demolish crossings failed, their explosives disrupted by Allied airstrikes. By April, 3 Rhine bridges stood firm, allowing tanks and artillery to flood into Germany's heartland, their advance unhindered by a crumbling Wehrmacht. The encirclement of German forces in the Ruhr, beginning in March 1945, marked a decisive blow. American and British armies, converging with mechanized precision, trapped 300,000 German troops, their surrender by April 18, gutting the Western Front. Soviet pressure on Berlin, simultaneous with Western advances, prevented Germany from redeploying reserves. Rail networks, vital for troop movements, operated at 20% capacity, crippled by bombing and sabotage. German commanders reporting to Berlin described units reduced to conscripts and obsolete tanks, unable to counter Allied mobility or firepower. The Luftwaffe, once Germany's aerial spear, was effectively extinct by 1945. With only 200 operational aircraft, its pilots faced overwhelming odds against Allied air forces, flying 2,000 sorties daily. Fuel shortages limited flights to 10 hours per aircraft, grounding squadrons across cratered airfields. Allied Mustangs and Spitfires, operating at 30,000 feet, strafed German positions unopposed, their range of 1,600 miles, ensuring no target was safe. German anti-aircraft guns, firing blindly, expended 10,000 shells per raid, a futile gesture against an enemy that ruled the skies. German soldiers, retreating across their own soil, abandoned equipment in droves, their morale shattered by constant air attacks. Panzer crews rationing fuel left tanks by roadsides, their turrets silent after 50 miles. Civilians fleeing advancing armies clogged highways, their carts piled with possessions as Allied aircraft roared overhead. Soviet troops entering East Prussia burned villages, their artillery turning fields into mud. American GIs crossing the Rhine marveled at Germany's ruined cities, their advance met by white flags and surrendered garrisons. Adversaries' view, German pilots grounded by empty tanks watched American Mustangs dominate the skies over Berlin. The Reich's last gambits had failed spectacularly. The Ardennes offensive, a desperate bid for leverage, exhausted Germany's panzer reserves, leaving the Western Front defenseless. Soviet advances, relentless and mechanized, tore through the east, their T-34 seconds outpacing German retreats. Rhine crossings, secured by Allied engineering, opened Germany to invasion, its natural barriers rendered irrelevant. The Luftwaffe's collapse, driven by fuel shortages and overwhelming Allied air power, removed any hope of slowing the enemy's ground advance. Germany bled dry on two fronts, faced the final unraveling of its war machine. Germany's late-war weapons, including Me-262 jet fighters and V-2 rockets, emerged in 1944, but their impact was negligible against overwhelming Allied strength. Factories battered by Allied bombing produced only 100 jets monthly, each grounded after 10 hours due to fuel shortages. V-2 rockets launched from mobile platforms struck London and Antwerp, but their 50-mile range limited strategic value. Hitler's orders, demanding rigid defense of every sector, prevented withdrawals to defensible lines, exhausting divisions in futile stands. Allied air forces flying 1,600-mile missions from British and French bases ensured no factory or fuel depot operated unmolested. The United States, Britain, Commonwealth forces, and the Soviet Union pressed relentlessly on two fronts, denying Germany any chance for a decisive counterstroke. Soviet T-34 seconds advancing 20 miles daily overwhelmed eastern defenses, while American and British tanks crossed the Rhine, their supply lines stretching 1,000 miles. German panzers, reduced to 500 operational units by March 1945, could not maneuver their fuel tanks dry after 50 miles. The number that matters is tanks. Germany fielded 500 operational panzers by March 1945. German commanders, convening in secret, acknowledged the strategic situation was irreversible, with Allied armies on German soil. Adversaries' view, German staff officers burning documents, knew Berlin's fall was weeks away. The Reich's collapse, fueled by delusion, was absolute. Hitler's fantasies of wonder weapons and final stands crumbled against Allied coordination and production. The skies, dominated by Allied bombers, and the ground overrun by tanks, left no hope.